you so much. I'd like to welcome Amber up to the stage. Everyone knows Amber and Outlier Solutions as being a huge supporter of the industry and our association, and she's here to impart more knowledge. Thank you so much.
I'm going to switch gears a little bit from what we've been talking about in the last couple of talks and talk about something that's a little bit more technical, but then I think probably helpful to everyone in this audience in terms of some of the technical compliance requirements that we have. I wouldn't be a good compliance nerd if I didn't start with a couple of quick disclaimers. So not a lawyer, not legal advice. I'm going to say some things about FINTRAC, my lovely table mates. And if you look over and you see them going, no girl, no, they're right, I'm wrong. And that's fine. They are the authority, I am not. And lastly, from an information should be free perspective, I think it's fair to say that it's free to share this presentation if you wish to. In terms of what we'll go through, I want to talk about policy interpretations today and what those have been historically. What's that history from an MSB perspective specifically? We ran a quick survey over the course of the summer just to understand how people in the industry have been using policy interpretations. And spoiler alert, those are no longer being published on FINTRAC's website. And what I want to talk about is how we as industry can adjust, can help each other, and can make sure that we're not hitting up against information asymmetries where we have different organizations that have a different understanding and are working differently. So we're just making errors because we're going based on the information that we have, which is incomplete or not as up to date as it could be. And then if we have time, I'll go through how to do a really good request for information, because although FINTRAC is no longer publishing policy interpretations on their website, industry folks can of course still request that FINTRAC opine on something, which is a good starting point to what is a policy interpretation. At its simplest, this is just we go to FINTRAC as a regulator, we say, hey, here's what the law says, here's what your guidance says, but I have this situation that I don't know where it falls in this spectrum, and I'm asking you to opine. It's an interpretation of the law of regulation or of guidance, and this can be especially important when we have changes to legislation. I think recently, I'm going to assume that just about everyone in this room has had a question about what constitutes an electronic funds transfer between 2022 and us sitting here together today. That was a big change to Canadian legislation. It came in quickly. I think it was surprising to a lot of us, and we all scrambled to figure out what that meant for our businesses. Policy interpretations have been issued by FINTRAC for a long time, but their official history is a little bit quirky. At the start, policy interpretations were issued privately. They were just issued to individual reporting entities that would ask for them. So a reporting entity would ask for a position, or their representative, which might be a lawyer or a consultant, would ask for a policy position, and we would get that. I left a big consulting firm when I founded Outlier, and one of the things that I realized is, geez, over the years of working there, I had all of these great interpretations that I could reference and that I could use, and I no longer had access to those. So how do I get those without doing something untoward? Is there any way I could get access to those? So I did what's known as an access to information request, which is like you write to the government and you say, I want this information. I don't want any personal information, I don't want any business sensitive information, but I'd love to get access. And I thought, geez, why would I just request all of the policy interpretations that I requested when I could request all of them? Which was a lot of hubris on my part. Someone from FINTRAC called me and said, what are you planning on doing with these? Why do you want this? What's your intent? Which makes sense because it was such a big, weird request, and I don't think I realized how big and weird it was. And I said, you know what? If you send them to me, I think what I'll do is maybe publish them on my website and keep being annoying and doing the request every 6 months and publishing them every 6 months. I hadn't thought it out in advance. That was just what came out of my mouth, and I didn't not mean it, but it wasn't I can't take credit for some master plan. And they said, oh, okay, weird, let us call you back. Sit tight. And then a couple days later, I got a call back, and the person that I spoke to said, would you be willing to accept if you give us a pretty long extension, because you have 30 days to respond to an access to information request? Can you give us an extended amount of time, but we'll actually publish them on our website? And I said, that would be amazing. And they did, and they continued to do that. There have been industry groups that some folks in this room have been part of that consulted on which PIs should be published and why. When things were archived, we as the CMSBA provided some guidance on which interpretations we relied on and what was important to us so that those could get updated. And I get it. It is a big, tedious process. It was a lot of work for FINTRAC to do. The last versions of PIs that are published on their website were published just, I think, prior to the update in the EFT wording in 2022, and so we haven't seen new publications since then. And now we're at the point where FINTRAC has indicated that they're not planning on publishing any new PIs. So we've kind of come full circle. I accept that that's where we stand right now, begrudgingly. And I want to illustrate why this is so important in terms of information to MSBs, and probably why there's maybe some issue in publishing some of these things. There was a policy interpretation that a lot of MSBs relied on prior to 2022. And businesses that are MSBs now that wouldn't have been MSBs at the time, which said that if you're doing specific kinds of payments related to utility bills, rent, mortgage payments, some tuition payments, or if you're doing merchant servicing, so you're just accepting payments on behalf of merchants and then passing those payments to the merchants, then you are out of scope for the AML regime. You weren't in scope as an MSB. And when the definition of an EFT changed, this policy interpretation was repealed, and you can see that's very public on FINTRAC's website, that this particular policy interpretation had been repealed, but it was something that was incredibly important to this community in understanding who's in scope and who's not in scope for the MSB regime. One of the things that I wanted to understand when FINTRAC talked about no longer publishing these policy interpretations is how we as industry were using them, because frankly, for me as a consultant to stand on a soapbox about things that really matter to me is not interesting if those things don't matter to the MSB community. So we ran a survey. It was relatively brief. We did it last summer. The data collection wasn't limited to MSBs, but I'm going to focus pretty specifically on the subset of MSBs that responded. And so in terms of the respondents, there was about 100 folks that responded. It was just, like I said, a brief online survey. Most of the respondents were actually reporting entities, and we subdivided that into who asked for, so who had asked for policy interpretations or not, because I think this is fascinating, or who had, in this case, who had relied on policy interpretations or not. So most of the respondents had at some point relied on a policy interpretation in some way. And I'll talk a little bit more about how we rely on policy interpretations after, but in terms of the groupings, of the subset that was reporting entities, 62% was MSBs. And so we have really good representation from this community. If you answered that survey, thank you. Of the MSBs that requested policy interpretations, that had used policy interpretations, most of them had never asked for a policy interpretation themselves. And I think this is particularly interesting when it comes to something like publication, because what this is saying is that I'm using this data to make information about to make decisions about my business. I'm using this in a way that's meaningful to me, but I myself haven't approached FINTRAC to get a policy interpretation. And then we have about a smaller proportion that have asked for one or two, and then this very thin slice, of which I proudly form a part, of 3% of us that have asked for 10 or more policy interpretations. And I assume those folks are probably more on the legal and consulting side and are asking for a lot of different things for a lot of different clients, which is not to say that I think that those things that they ask for are any less meaningful than things asked for by industry. Of the MSBs, we looked at how useful folks found policy interpretations, and of those MSB respondents, we have 88% saying that they found those helpful to some extent, and quite a big chunk saying that they found them extremely helpful. We also asked about not just policy interpretations generally, so we're talking about here just generally how useful are policy interpretations for MSBs, but how valuable do you find that publication on FINTRAC's website? And we see a slightly higher number here, which I found interesting, of folks saying, yes, it's really important that those be published somewhere, that they be accessible. And I think those differences are really important to note, because we don't have everyone that's necessarily going to have a comfort level reaching out to the regulator that's going to know how to ask a question or what the right level of question to ask is. In terms of how MSBs actually used the policy interpretations, there was a small subset, so again, 90% of the MSBs had said that they used them in some way. In a previous slide, there's a small subset here that says that they didn't actually use them. But we have the whole gamut of types of decisions that you might make. So decisions about your MSBs, advising other entities that might be your clients, understanding AML generally. One of the statistics here that I found fascinating was that 25% of the respondents had said that they had used policy interpretations in some way as part of a voluntary self-declaration of noncompliance. And that to me is massive. What that's saying is that we've looked at what's been published and said, oh, I have erred in how I'm doing compliance. I've made a mistake in some meaningful way. I might need to file some STRs that I hadn't filed previously, that I didn't realize should be STRs. I might be redoing some EFTs where I realized that I've actually filed them wrong, or I didn't understand who was supposed to be a third party in this context. So there's all of these different ways that this can become part of the realization that we've actually made a mistake and need to do some type of voluntary self-declaration. In making resource decisions, so how do we use technology? What technologies do we use? Do we have the right technology there? And I didn't get more granular than this, but I'm going to make the assumption that a lot of that actually had to do with identification-related technologies, because we've had a lot of changes in how we do identification non-face-to-face. And there's a lot of specificity in terms of what records we need to keep that our technology providers need to meet. I think one of the important things that we always have to remember about our AML regime is that we can outsource a function. So I can hire someone to do a thing for me, but I am always accountable for that compliance. You can never outsource the responsibility or the accountability. In terms of the timelines, and again, these are strictly from respondents that said we're in-house at an MSB. One of the things that came up was the idea that the publications weren't particularly timely. So they wanted to see more publication, especially after we'd had a change to rules or guidance that was significant to MSBs. That sometimes there was contradictory information that seemed to appear in some of the PIs. And I think some of that is contextual. In what's published publicly, anything that was identifying or sensitive about a business had to be redacted. And so I do agree that sometimes there probably wasn't enough detail to fully understand the context. And certain things might have seemed contradictory that maybe actually weren't. And sometimes there may have actually been different advice given at different points as well. But it's hard to say without that full visibility. And that some PIs were too vague and didn't provide enough context. And I think those are all good pieces of feedback. And I mention that because in the absence of these policy interpretations being published publicly, I think we as the MSB community and the Canadian MSB Association has some decisions to make about how we deal with that to make sure that we're avoiding information asymmetries. How do we avoid the situation where Corinta is looking at an EFT and she says, well, no, this is clearly the conductor of this EFT. And Marcel and her team are doing an audit and they're looking at it and saying, no, but our understanding of a conductor is completely different. This is a problem. We should all have the same understanding with the same set of facts. And I think there's a lot that we can do as a community in the absence of publications that are actually helpful from that regard. I want to open this as a forum. I don't think I have a panacea of answers, but I want to talk about the tools that are there and that are available to us. One of the venues that exists is that the CMSBA has members-only forums. This is on the CMSBA's website. When you're logged in as a member, you have access to a slew of information, and there's some pretty great stuff there. I pre-discussed this with Joseph, and one of the things that we've been doing as the advocacy committee, and that I think certain other folks also do pretty frequently, is that when we see something with one of our clients, if one of our colleagues receives an interpretation that we think, geez, this has a big impact for MSBs generally. This isn't so nuanced that it only applies to my business, but this applies to a lot of different businesses. We've been looking at how we can publish those on the forum, how we can put that information out there. And this can happen in a couple of different ways. That can either come through the advocacy committee. If you're saying, like, I'm really not interested in publishing it with my MSB's name attached to it, you can send it to the CMSBA either with information that might be identifying already stripped out, or have us strip that information out for you and send it back to you to make sure that that's good, and then we'll publish it so that it doesn't have any associated names. Or as a member, if you're looking at it and saying, I'm comfortable, there's nothing here that I'm uncomfortable with it being associated with my business, you're actually able to publish that yourself within the context of those forums. And I think that's a tool that we should be using more frequently as CMSBA members, just to be able to share that information, especially when we see rule changes, especially when we see things around the new types of MSBs that are coming in. I think MSBs, as far as our AML regulatory regime in Canada, have become a little bit of a Katamari ball, where every time we want to add a new type of reporting entity, they're getting wrapped in under the MSB umbrella. So we're in good company, and there will be more of us. And given that, how do we keep educating? I think there are good options there. I wanted to add some caveats there as well, just in terms of the way that we share that information. When FINTRAC published the policy interpretations on their website, they were very careful not to make it business specific. So I think when we're thinking about what we want to put in the forums, we really want to make sure that we're contextualizing that. And I think sometimes as compliance officers, we really want to be candid. We really want to share that information with each other, and we all want to make sure that we're on the same page. But I would say that's something that you want to consider whether you're exposing any information that you don't want to expose. You need to make sure that you have the buy-in from your senior management, because it would be heartbreaking to me if someone ended up being in trouble from an employment perspective because they had posted something on a forum that they weren't authorized to do. So if I have an ask from my compliance folks in the room, it would be that we go away and socialize this so that when we start receiving these things, we're ready to be able to share them in a way that's meaningful to other colleagues in the industry on these forums and potentially in other forums. And this is where I would say, if you have ideas about better ways to share this, better ways to discuss this, the CMSBA is all ears, and I'm certainly all ears. I think it's also an important caveat that there are a lot of different MSB business models, and increasingly more MSB business models. And so we have to make the questions that we have when we're doing those postings sufficiently detailed that it's meaningful. And I'll go back to those commentaries about just where did folks struggle with PIs, and some of that really being that it was too vague to understand what it actually meant. And so I think part of this caveat is that if the question that you've asked is so specific that it's not going to be applicable to other MSBs, or that in order to really understand the answer, you'd have to give away business-sensitive information that you don't want to provide, it's probably not something that you're going to want to exist in a publication format that any other member would be accessing. And I think the other bit that's incredibly important is that things change over time. This is simply a function, and I don't think whether it's something that I say or a regulator says that we expect it to last forever. Legislation changes, the interpretation of legislation changes, and that's okay. But the important thing for us as industry is that when we're thinking about these asymmetries in information, not that we're trying to set something in stone so that it's absolutely the same forever, but when these changes do happen, we're sharing that information. We're collectively making sure that we let our colleagues know to the extent that we can do that, and just trying to eliminate those information asymmetries where we can. And that's it. That's the pitch, friends.
I don't have a question. I just want to put my voice of support. You and I came on the same journey when I was in a particular financial institution. The interpretation notices, not only the FINTRAC ones, but FinCEN one was very important for us in terms of managing risks. And I'm adding my voice. I want to see FINTRAC find a way of publishing them again. The US, FinCEN has gone a step further, and not only that they're publishing, they are now publishing the actual letters. They redact information for the notices and the responses in detail as to why they made this certain decision or guidance. So I'm adding my voice, FINTRAC.
Amber, what's the downside to this? Like, what would be the downside to the CMSBA doing this and the membership really buying in and doing our part to kind of populate this forum?
So other than the caveats that I mentioned, because this was exactly where the caveat slide came from, is that I thought through it, like, what could go wrong? And being a compliance officer is just putting on your dark mirror hat a bunch of the time and thinking, like, how could this go off the rails and bite us in the bum? And I think provided that we have buy-in from management, provided that we're appropriately redacting the information and sharing it, I don't see a downside. And feel free to disagree if there is disagreement on that point.
From relying on previous PIs. So I'm an MSB. I wrote a PI 2 years ago. I've been sitting on that. Nothing changed in regulation versus we're looking at probably some updates coming to the PCML TFA at some point relatively soon. How often do I need to refresh that existing PI, or can I just stick it in a folder and rely on it in perpetuity?
I think it depends. We always get new information. We always see new interpretations of information. And I think there's a few interesting ones. We've published a mea culpa on the Outlier website where we had talked about when does an MSB, so for a startup MSB, you're brand spanking new, when does the clock start ticking for your first effectiveness review? And I had always thought that the answer was that it's 2 years from the date that you register as an MSB. And that was not correct. It was 2 years from the date that you serve a client as an MSB, that you do MSB business. But we had given that advice. We'd had it in effectiveness reviews. And when we saw an interpretation that was different, the law hadn't changed, but it changed our minds, and we published about it, and we talked about it. So I think you always have to be aware that the law might not change, but there might be an interpretation that you might not be aware of. There might be a fact pattern that you're not aware of. So it never ends as a compliance officer. You have to stay on top of it. You have to surf the change.
Thank you. Similar mea culpa, foreign exchange. If you offer foreign exchange as part of an electronic fund transfer, that constitutes foreign exchange activity. So make sure that box is checked on your MSB registration. It is not just for standalone foreign exchange.
Did you post that on the forum, sir?
Yes.
All right.
Deanna.
More of an observation or feedback, and I'm sure most MSBs can relate to PIs as using them to interpret complex or maybe not so complex items. So this may be more towards FINTRAC. It was used a lot by MSBs to understand where they fell in and out. But if you're considering maybe not doing PIs, is there other options, like case scenarios, where if you're doing this, this may apply or may not? So maybe if it's not the PI side of it, maybe some case scenarios that are more broad. Yes, it's a more public awareness for the MSBs that may not be reaching out independently.
Yeah, I think that's fair. And again, I don't speak for the agency, but I know that there's a number of things that are being worked on in terms of guidance and having nuanced guidance and more case examples of things and industry-specific case examples. And I think, do you still have a plain language editor? Yes, no, maybe? No? Okay. So I think there is. I know at one point I met the human and they were lovely. But plain language editing, which I think if, I'm well-spoken, but also ESL, English is my second written language. So I always appreciate that just simple, straightforward, punchy, easy to understand writing. And I know that there's been tremendous efforts that FINTRAC has made in that regard and that we appreciate them, but keep them coming.
Amber, I wanted to check, when we are creating technology solutions to automate processes based on policies, in case there is a policy interpretation which was done, maybe based on a model that's slightly changed, or there is some evolution on that model of an MSB, is it necessary to kind of write to FINTRAC to reconfirm that, or can we interpret that policy based on the previous interpretation that was given?
It depends on what changed. So I think a lot of those interpretations that have existed have been the ones that are like based on my business model. Am I an MSB? Am I not an MSB? Am I just a technology provider? Am I just merchant servicing, which now is clearly MSB? So I think once something changes, you have to look at the materiality of that thing. And so is it really just the same thing, but it was a minor tweak, but the material facts that they were looking at haven't changed? Or is it something that could bring it into scope and make it an MSB or cross over into something else? So it depends. It's a horrible consultantly answer, but there's always nuance there.
Got it. Thank you.
Are there any other questions? Any online questions? No. I'm going to just offer 2 cents. I think if nothing else, having a forum like this that our membership can access is going to provide insight and like grounded opinion, as opposed to what we're doing right now, which is a little bit of the blind leading the blind. So, because informally, we're going to lean on each other and say, well, do you understand what this meant, and what does that mean? And without this kind of resource, we could all be just jumping in the wrong direction, right? So thank you. That was amazing. And on behalf of the association, thank you for everything that you do, including this presentation.
Thank you. And if you're looking for the forum, there's a link on the screen and it's in the appendix to the presentation.